Hey there, Mr. Robinson.
Hey there, Mr. Smith.
So, is there anything you would like to talk about?
I have only one thing I want to talk about this evening, Mr. Smith, and that is podcasting.
Greetings and welcome to our inaugural podcast here on livingyouth.org. Welcome, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Welcome to you. Welcome
Thank
to
you.
your own podcast.
Thank you very much. We say our inaugural podcast, but we've actually recorded. How many of these do you think we've recorded, Mr. Robinson?
I honestly think we've done 5.
Yeah, you might be right. We've done several, but they were really demos to proof of concept. We had several people to give us feedback, so hopefully you have a more finely tuned instrument, what you're getting now. But so we do have these demo ones, but this is our first one to release, and we thought it would be a good idea to try to avoid our tendency to elaborate and go on and give you rather a quick, snappy intro to explain what this podcast is all about. I'll be really upfront. This is our second attempt to be able to pull this off. Mr. Robinson, you think we're going to pull off quick and snappy this time?
It's not off to a good start.
All right, but we're going to launch right into it. What is our organizing principle for this initial podcast, Mr. Robinson?
We have 5 questions that we wish to ask and answer that explains the purpose of this podcast.
I think that's an excellent organizing principle. So, Mr. Robinson, fire away. What is the first question?
The first question is the most natural one, is what is this podcast about?
That is a very natural question. We would like in this podcast to look at news, culture, and current events. And in doing so, we want to model biblical thinking. We want to give the Bible's answers about questions concerning news, culture, and current events. And the rest of the world isn't thinking about these things biblically, but we want to model good, solid, biblical thinking. Mr. Robinson, how would you describe the purpose of the podcast?
Well, in addition to what you said, we would like to answer questions that youth in the church commonly ask, topics maybe that wouldn't always get covered in a Bible study or a sermon, and any Q&As that we get in there of topics that we think are interesting and would benefit the youth.
Right, we're actually hoping to hear from them, right? That people would actually send in questions and such. Hey, one question down. We're doing great. All right, what's the second question?
Keeping it snappy. Who are we, Mr. Smith?
Who are we? All right, what we'd like to do for this is introduce each other. And we're going to do our best not to go on and on. Sitting across from me here at the desk is Mr. John Robinson. He is the managing editor of Tomorrow's World and the Living Church of God. He is responsible, frankly, for managing so many of the processes that get the magazines and such out on time and of good quality. He deals with vendors everywhere. He also is responsible for the look and feel of our products. So I've heard from many people that they feel like they're looking better and better, and Mr. Robinson would be the person to thank for that. I'd also add he has a lot of experience in the camp programs in the church, around 10 years or so, including years way back at the Texas camp where he was a counselor of so many little ones that I see running around now. They're not really running around anymore. They're older now. But anyway, he's been around for a long time and is a very trusted friend. So that is Mr. John Robinson.
Now, who is this Mr. Wallace Smith? He is a telecast presenter for the Tomorrow's World program. He is the executive editor of the Living Church of God. And he also has extensive camp experience, which is one of the things we bonded over when we first met. Over 15 years in the camp program, and also 7 to 8 years, we couldn't agree on it, as the camp director in a preteen in Missouri. And speaking on both our behalves, we've enjoyed all that time and have been thankful to get to be a part of it.
Oh yeah, very much so. All right, look at us. Quick and snappy. Mr. Robinson, we're doing great. What's the third question?
All right. What do we bring to this podcast?
All right, this is a little tricky because, Luke 14, you don't want to talk about yourself too much, but I can say what I hope to bring, and I think we can do that. We're both ministers, of course. Personally, for me, I hope I can bring some perspective in the sense that I did not have the privilege of growing up in the church. I wish that I had. So for 18 years, a little more than that, I'm out there tossed to and fro with the philosophies and ideas of the world. I did start learning the truth at 14, but still was in there. So often when I would hear ministers right after I started attending, and they would talk about why we do certain things in the church. And I could look back at my life before the church and I could think, oh, I wish I had known that before, for the 18 years of my life before. And so I'm hoping I can bring some of that perspective to the podcast, in addition to hopefully a great deal of calculus and algebra facts that would be helpful for many.
Our next podcast will be the math podcast.
And what about you, Mr. Robinson? What is something you hope to bring to the podcast?
Well, when I first met you, one of the things I thought was interesting was that you hadn't grown up in the church, because it felt so much like you had. You understood the church culture very well, and you were so integrated. I had a very different experience than you did, in the sense that I did grow up in the church. In fact, as I was thinking about it, my father was 5 when they started attending the church. So, I even had an experience of my parents had been in the church since they were very young. I think my mom was in her teens when they started attending with Radio Church of God, I think.
So you're like third generation then.
Yes. And so I had a different experience of growing up in the church and just taking for granted that you keep the Sabbath and that you take time off at school for the Feast of Tabernacles. And thanks, Dad, he always made me go ask my teachers to have the time off for the feast. He didn't do that for me. And I remember it was a real wake-up call for me. I still remember it pretty specifically. We had moved to Arlington, and my dad was going to be the pastor of the Fort Worth Church, and I was pretty friendly, and I met a boy there in our neighborhood, and we were friends. And come to find out, he goes to church on Sunday. And then I came to find out that most of the kids go to church on Sunday, and I was the odd one going on the Sabbath. So you felt a little bit different, but there were so many, I can't think of another way to put it, but bad habits that you didn't learn. Like I remember talking to an older gentleman years ago who told me to never underestimate having never learned about Christmas. He said it was the hardest thing for him and his family to stop keeping Christmas. And, that was something I never had to deal with. But growing up, I did not have a good understanding of why people kept Sunday, what their reasoning and rationale was for it. And so things like that I had to learn later. And you also don't go through that period that you hear so many people talk about when they come into the truth. They talk about, I've learned the truth, and it's so exciting in their life. And when you're growing up in the church, you don't have that same level of just sudden realization, and so you can take it for granted a little bit.
Well, thanks. I do think between the two of us, we'll provide helpful perspective. All right. Well, look at us, quick and snappy. All right, next question, Mr. Robinson.
So, what should you, as the audience, expect from this podcast?
That is a great question. We are still thinking about the different things we could do in this podcast, but among the things that we've played with and done with the demos, one, we'd like to have question and answer based podcasts. That would be some of our podcasts. And we're really counting on you guys to submit questions to us. We do have a collection of questions from teen Bible studies in the past, even questions from younger people we've talked to, over the last year or so. And like Mr. Robinson said earlier, sometimes maybe you don't think your question is important enough, or it's something that's kind of awkward to cover in a sermonette, or something like the one that we will probably put on the website, where we talk about, is it possible to take pigs and if they chew the cud, make them clean. So we like to cover questions like that, and we're really counting on you guys to provide those questions, because we want what we do to be relevant and helpful for you guys. We'd also just generally like to discuss topics of what's going on, like we said earlier, in news, culture, and current events. The fact is, the world is changing in a dramatic way on so many fronts, and all of those things impact us no matter what age we are in the church. And we'd like to have the opportunity to talk about those on the podcast and help you see what it means to think biblically about those things. Mr. Robinson?
Are there any plans to have any guests on the podcast?
That might be a sixth question. I'm not sure. I'm just kidding. All right. Yes, we would also like to have guests. That is very correct. In fact, we don't know if we're going to have him on the podcast or if he'll be too busy, but who's coming next week, Mr. Robinson?
Mr. Mark Sandor will be in town, and we have hopes if we can have the time to record a podcast with him before he leaves.
Yeah, that would be great. He's a history expert, and neither of us are, even though Mr. Robinson has history podcasts.
I listen to podcasts good enough.
So we'd like to have Mr. Robinson on. We have a few people we'd love to be able to have on the podcast over time. Some ministers you already know, some you don't, people who aren't ministers. But we hope that the podcast can serve as an opportunity for you to become more familiar with them. I think that's good for now. We'll see. We're really interested also, again, in your ideas. What are some things that you think would be beneficial from a podcast like this on livingyouth.org? Please do let us know. And we're about to slide into home base, Mr. Robinson, or round third, or whatever.
A rounding third.
I'm not the sports analogy guy. So what's the fifth question, Mister?
Question 5.5. Is there a name for this amazing podcast?
Hey, how about this amazing podcast? Would that be a good name?
The podcast guys from Charlotte.
Yeah, this amazing podcast would be a little presumptive, I think. Let's just say right now we don't have a podcast because we'd like to get input from you. Currently, as you just heard Jake and Julia sing so, I was going to say mellifluously, but as an editor, I really want to check on that word. They said Smith and Robinson, but mainly because that's our names. We're very open to different ideas for the podcast name, so we would like your thoughts. We'll warn you, this is not a democracy. Just because a lot of you like a name doesn't mean we're going to like it. This is what do we think of this as, Mr. Robinson? It's not a democracy.
It's a benevolent dictatorship.
Benevolent dictatorship. If you'd like, just a side note, if you'd like to see a fascinating history of what happens when you ask the internet to decide things, just look up Bodie McBoatface. That's quite a tale. So no, it's definitely not going to be a vote of some sort, but we'd like your thoughts as well. And so why don't we wait a few podcasts, start to kind of get a feel in terms of what it's like and how it's helpful, and we'd like you guys to help us come up with a name. And Mr. Robinson, I think we did it.
I think we did it.
Smith and Robinson.